Hello, everybody. Welcome to Village Voices. I'm Trudy Peterson. I coordinate Village Voices on behalf of Capitol Hill Village. Capitol Hill Village has been running this program now for a number of years, and we need to recognize the people who make it possible, not just me. Mary Bloodworth is our technical support, without which I promise you this would not be on the air. May Jean Daniels and Karen Stuck get our publicity out so you know what's coming up and what time and what place it's going to be. And of course, Judy Berman from the village, without which none of this would work at all. We are recording this program, so be aware of that as you make comments. If indeed during our guest talk, you have things that you just really want to ask and you're afraid you'll forget by the end of her discussion, please use the chat. Mary and I will both be watching the chat and we'll make sure we get to those comments and questions at the end of the discussion. Now, tonight we have with us a journalist. We have Georgina Gustin, who works for this wonderful organization called Inside Climate News. If you don't know Inside Climate News, you really should. It's a 501c3, been around for almost 2 decades. So it's a nonprofit that tries to look at the real impact of climate. And it's not just a little snippet from a newspaper. It's really thoughtful essays about what is happening with the climate and how it affects everything from science to politics to, as Georgina often focuses on, agriculture. I was interested in getting Georgina to talk to us because as bird flu started to spread across the nation, and we started to see the implications of that with heat and climate change and the spread of that into other species, it became clear that this is something we all need to know a lot more about. Georgina's won numerous awards for her journalism. She has had the award for Distinguished Environmental Journalism. She was twice named the Glenn Cunningham Agricultural Journalist of the Year, and she's been a reporter for other organizations as well, including Roll Call, St. Louis Post-Dispatch, and she's had articles published in the Times and the Post and the National Geographic and all those usual places. She's a graduate of the Columbia School of Journalism and the University of Colorado at Boulder. And I suspect her interest in agriculture and climate change has a lot to do with the University of Boulder rather than maybe Columbia University. But I don't really know that. Georgina tells us she's just back from a reporting trip to Senegal. So with that, Georgina, talk to us about climate change and health and what you're learning.
Yeah, thank you so much, Trudy, for inviting me and Mary for being the technical support, and to all of you for joining in tonight. And I really apologize for having to reschedule this, but I was, as Trudy says, reporting from Senegal and had some travel plans get kind of changed up on me there. So yeah, I actually, when I was at the University of Colorado, I was a silly undergraduate, and I actually thought I was going to be a poet or a novelist or something. So the interest in food and food systems came much later. I'd been a reporter for a few years at that point. I'd graduated from Columbia, and I was working at the St. Louis Post-Dispatch, where I was for 9 years. Actually, my husband, who's also a reporter, he said, you're so interested in food and where it comes from. Maybe you should pitch the editors a beat covering agriculture and food systems. And at the time, that was kind of a novel idea, actually, because most food coverage was in what you might call the lighter parts of the newspaper, the feature section, and it had more to do with recipes and that kind of thing. But I really thought that food should be covered a little bit more seriously. And um, since then, a lot more people have started. I certainly wasn't the first, but a lot more people have started to cover it as well. And I've had a long interest in environmental issues, and my particular interest in food is in how its production is impacting our natural resources, and in particular, how it's impacting climate change, and vice versa, how climate change is affecting our ability to produce food when we are projected to hit 10 billion people on this planet by 2050. It's a big challenge, and, when I tell people what I write about, they say, "Oh, well, that sounds." I think it sounds quite narrow to some people, but it's really there's more than I can possibly cover, and it's a huge topic and one I find particularly interesting. And as Trudy mentioned, I just got back from Senegal, where I'm writing about some farming efforts in northern Senegal and the Senegal River Valley, where they are growing crops that arguably should not be grown there for export, and very little of that is benefiting the local population um, and in a food insecure part of the world that especially one that's being so severely hit by climate change, that seems like not a very good proposition. So that's what I was in Senegal writing about. And very luckily, in a shrinking news ecosystem, I have very supportive editors who uh, help me find funding to do ambitious stories in all parts of the world. And Inside Climate News, we are a not for profit, and the model, as you've watched so many news outlets struggle, the not for profit kind of niche model has been working for us. We're actually expanding. We have when I started, we had I think 9 reporters, and now I think we have 30. And we're focused solely on climate change and environmental issues. We are most known probably for winning a Pulitzer Prize very early on in our life, and then for breaking a very big story that is now kind of common knowledge, but at the time wasn't. And that story was that Exxon, the oil giant, knew that its product was causing climate change and did not tell shareholders. So the whole Exxon knew concept um, was something that my colleagues broke. I wish I could say I had something to do with it, but I didn't. Um, but yeah, so that's a little bit of history. And I uh, I don't write specifically about climate change and disease, but I do when it intersects with agriculture. And of course, in recent years, that intersection has become more prominent and newsy, first with COVID and other zoonotic diseases, but most recently with H5N1, or bird flu, or what's also called high path avian influenza. Um, so I'm sure you all know quite a bit about it, but um, i- bird flu is endemic in wild bird populations, and but this most recent outbreak started in 2022 um, when it jumped from wild birds to chicken flocks. And then in March of last year, it jumped again from a chicken or chickens to a cow. And since then, tens of millions of birds have been culled. and thousands of cattle have died, mostly dairy cattle in California, which is the biggest dairy state, and has the biggest dairy herd. Um, and I You'll have to fact my numbers might not be totally up to date, but I think something like 70 people have been affected now. But so far, there has been no human to human transmission. It's only been animal to human, um, many of those cases have been in poultry workers, including those who were involved in culling those tens of millions of birds, which is currently the protocol for dealing with this influenza. Um, and one person has died or had as of January of this year. Again, the number might need updating there. But where climate change comes into the picture is basically it throws all kinds of predictability and patterns out of whack. So you have migratory birds that are carrying this virus that once flew at predictable times and in predictable places, now leaving earlier for their migrations or migrating in different places. And um, and the populations of um, animals there, or whether domestic or wild, are not accustomed to seeing these patterns. So you have more disease transmission in places where or opportunities for disease transmission where you didn't before. So climate change is causing those disturbances, but then you have agricultural conditions that are exacerbated by climate change. So you have, if when you put a lot of, a- as you probably know, most of the livestock raised in this country is raised in confinement or in concentrated um, uh, facilities. And when you put a bunch of genetically similar animals together in close proximity, that are often stressed, and then you add heat on top of it, you have what some researchers have called a petri dish for these zoonotic diseases to spread. So you have kind of all of the right conditions for for a for an outbreak like this. And of course, this is not the only way climate change potentially, um, spikes diseases. You have um, more heat-related deaths. You have pesticide volatility because of heat. You have more flooding and more pathogens, waterborne pathogens. Um, I came across a study that I'm going to write about in the next couple of weeks about how arsenic in rice levels of arsenic is projected to go up in rice under heat, warming conditions, and could potentially be a health threat, especially in parts of the world that are dependent on rice. So climate change has all of these potential effects. The kind of pathways are kind of staggering. But when it comes to zoonotic diseases like avian influenza, it kind of takes an intersection of the animal, the heat, the stress, and the concentration of animals for outbreaks like this to happen. And um, this is a little far apart or a little far away from climate change, but there was a lot of research around COVID when that outbreak happened, that that suggested that if habitat continues to be destroyed, including forests, which are carbon storing ecosystems, what happens is you destroy the habitat for all animals, but particularly for longer lived large animals. They need more range, they need more resources, they live longer. Um, and they put more of their biological energy, so to speak, into the reproduction of a small number of animals over the over longer period of time. And um, so when you shrink habitat, which has climate consequences, these animals can't thrive or survive. The animals that do thrive and survive are the smaller ones, like vermin, or bats, that put all of their energy into um, reproducing a lot of offspring, and all of their energy goes into that, and they shed diseases like COVID faster. So, if you have these conditions like deforestation of the Amazon, um, or you have monoculture crops, you create these habitat changes that that are bad for the climate, but also make it easier for these faster lived, highly reproductive animals to survive, and they're the ones that spread disease. So that's kind of I guess the intersection of the things that I write about that are coming home for many of us. Obviously, COVID was a huge um, economic and and health uh, uh, catastrophe, with repercussions that we're still seeing and will for a long time. Arguably, that has a agricultural slash zoonotic origin, and and then with H5N1, you have major political outcomes from that. Eggs, the price of eggs, of course, which were driven higher in part because of the culling of all these uh, uh, laying flocks, became a big factor in the last election and the election of Trump. So these things tend to have a lot of connections that maybe we wouldn't see before. But if you lay a warming environment on top of any of these conditions, it really does have kind of this petri dish effect, and that's how it ends up affecting us in our lives. So yeah, that's my I'm happy to talk about any other aspect of climate change and agriculture and food systems, but that's sort of the rundown on bird flu and a little bit about COVID. So um, I'm happy to talk about anything else or to take any questions.
Thank you, Georgina. You mentioned pesticide volatility, and I'm not
Mhm.
sure I understand what that has to do with anything.
Okay. Good question. So a lot of pesticides are react badly, for lack of a better word, when it's hotter. And so there's some evidence that these pesticides um, can affect. They're more volatile. They become airborne with heat, basically.
And does that mean they affect people if they are airborne in a way they wouldn't, absent the heat?
That is what some research suggests. Yes.
That's pretty scary, actually.
Hmm.
Um,
Yeah, it is. I mean, and the the agricultural system we work in, I know that you know a lot of this, but I'm guessing, Trudy, that you grew up on a diversified farm. You probably did a lot of things, grew alfalfa, raised livestock, did a few other things. Most farms in the central part of the US do two things, or maybe three things. And when you do that over and over and over and over again, and you use the same chemicals and you use the same systems, um, including including a reliance on a particular pesticide or a particular herbicide, if you then you're sort of out of luck. You don't have any other options, and if it heats up on you, then uh, absent other choices for farming, for either for what you're going to farm or produce, or what you're going to use to produce what you already produce, um, then it becomes a problem potentially.
So what are the options? I mean, we've seen all these political uh, proposals of great international organizations saying we've got to get down to an increase of X amount of temperature, and yet we don't see that happening in governments around the world. So,
Well, that's a really, really good and complicated question. So, of course, Trump has pulled us out of the Paris Climate Accord, um, which is a treaty. I don't want to. Maybe all of you know a lot about this, so I apologize if I'm um, dumbing this down. But in 2015, most of the world's countries agreed to try to meet certain climate targets by reducing their greenhouse gas emissions in alignment with lowering temperatures by 1.5 degrees or 2 degrees Celsius. Each of these countries then submit what are known as nationally determined contributions, and they submit these to the UN or the IPCC, uh, which is the UN related body that oversees the Paris Climate Accord or Paris Climate Agreement. And in these nationally determined contributions, each country says, I will do X or Y to lower my to lower greenhouse gas emissions in line with getting global temperatures down, essentially, or keeping them within a certain livable threshold. That has basically failed. Um, and we hit the 1.5-degree threshold last year globally. Emissions are growing. And while there is a huge move to pursue renewable energy, it has not compensated for the fact that we're still drilling for oil. Our economy is entirely dependent on fossil fuels, and there are entrenched political ideologies that prevent positive movement on this front um, in this country, which is historically the world's biggest greenhouse gas emitter. Right now, that's China, but historically, we have produced more greenhouse gases than any other country ever. Arguably have a greater responsibility to do something about lowering our emissions, but we're not doing that. And with this there was a big push under Biden and Obama, but under this administration, in fact, we're going in the entirely opposite direction. I can happy to get into all the various ways that the last 6 weeks have put those efforts on display. And sorry, I'm like a head in the dark here.
that's right.
Light. And so uh, yeah. And in the global context, we have China, who's now the biggest greenhouse gas emitter, the biggest sort of contributor to climate change. They have made a huge push towards renewables and so-called green energy, and they are leaving the U.S. in the dust. Essentially, they're moving ahead with electric vehicles and photovoltaics and all kinds of green technologies, and selling those technologies to the rest of the world, and moving, outpacing the US by leaps and bounds. Um, uh, but here in the US, we are retrenching. We're going back to more drilling. We're opening up public lands to drilling. We're overturning vehicle emissions mandates. We're cutting climate research across a number of important agencies like NOAA, USDA, EPA, and on and on and on. But I digress.
Um, we're talking, you and I, about the government and the government's responsibilities, but obviously, big industry plays a huge part in it. And if you fly into a place like Southeast Asia and you come into one of those airports, you often come in right over huge fields of nothing but palm trees for
Mhm.
palm oil.
Mhm.
Um, and I was once in where you were in Senegal in the airport talking to a man from who had just been brought in as a consultant to look at what was going to be a really good productive use of some land. And he said he felt really torn because the productive use that was going to give the most economic boost was going to be palm oil. And yet he knew what damage that was going to cause. And was he going to tell the people who had hired him, plant palm trees, or was he going to take some other kind of advice? So we've got big industry in here as well that maybe doesn't care a whole lot what the governments do.
Well, it kind of depends. I mean, in the case of palm oil, there was a very successful, arguably very successful. I mean, the biggest growers are in Southeast Asia and Indonesia in particular. There was the roundtable on sustainable palm oil production. Um, and that actually had a pretty big impact on reversing deforestation related to palm oil. And the it's considered one of the sort of success stories of the last 10 years when it comes to agriculture and environmental destruction, and reversing that environmental destruction. So um, but um, there's money to be made from growing things in ways that are efficient and polluting oftentimes. And when there's money to be made, sometimes governments look the other way, as in the case of the Amazon under the previous administration prior to Lula, the current president. Um, and sometimes that economic imperative prevails over ecological or environmental ones. And that has been the case certainly with fossil fuels. Um, we've known for a long time that fossil fuels have a climate impact. We've known as early, in 1988, famously, Michael Mann told Congress, this is a problem and we need to do something about it. But nothing ever did happen, or it was very slow to take root because we have a very powerful oil industry in this country, and they don't want to hear anything about slowing fossil fuel use. And famously, Imhoff from Oklahoma, the senator, went into the floor of the Senate chamber, I think, holding a snowball, saying that it's still cold outside, and the decades-long campaign by the oil industry to discredit scientists who believe in climate, whose research supported climate change, was very effective, and it's become a political issue. You look at the not just the current administration, but previous ones, and even the ones that were, accepted climate change as a reality, as a human and caused reality. They were, I mean, it was difficult to do anything about it. There was more drilling under Biden, more oil production under Biden than there was under Trump 1. So, um, uh, the environment always, I hate to sound cynical or skeptical rather, but unfortunately the environment usually loses when it's standing in the way of a human or a corporation and the money to be made.
Let me take this moment to ask if we've got hands raised. I don't see them. I don't see anything in the chat. There's a hand. Tom Zaniello. Unmute yourself if you'd like.
All right, go ahead.
Okay.
There we go.
Can you hear me?
Yes.
Good. Not directly to what you've been speaking about, but I'm very concerned about scientific literacy. Just the other day, a gaggle of reporters confronted Robert Kennedy with the fact of numerous peer-reviewed, high-quality scientific reviews said there is no correlation between vaccines and autism. He immediately shot back that he has a study from England that shows there is a correlation.
Causation.
Now,
Okay.
the problem is that people don't know that that study comes from a doctor researcher who has been barred from, debarred, if that's the word I want, from medical society, that his research was worthless. And Kennedy's response essentially was that there are alternatives, cod liver oil and vitamin A, to treat diseases. And in fact, he wants to have
What's your question?
he wants to have a study of the relationship of vaccines and autism, although it's been done numerous times already. So what can be done about this crisis, which is not literally campus climate, but has to do with the bedrock of our scientific literacy?
Yeah, it's a great question, and it very much is relative to climate science in lots of ways. But the, there are ways to explain some of the scientific illiteracy when it comes to climate change. And that is just sort of political. I'm not excusing it. I'm saying there's kind of you can see a rational relationship between a lack of acceptance of science and what and profit, for lack of a better word. And if you have half of Congress taking money from the oil industry, you can see why they would say, oh, this is bad science. There is no such thing as climate change. And in the example that you give, that just seems to me Kennedy's insistence on pointing to bad science doesn't have that rational relationship. It just seems to be his bugaboo, his thing. And because he has pulled out of the ether some a discredited study, and he has a hunch about things. And so that's just how he's moving forward. So confronted with it doesn't matter, obviously, you know this, but how much research he is confronted with, he's going to say that that is conspiratorial, or it's wrong, or that the truth has been hidden, and we need to study this further. I don't really know. I mean, how to explain. I mean, he's such an outlier in government. I don't even really know how to talk about him rationally or sensibly. But
Unfortunately, he's the outlier now in charge of the store.
Right, I know. And that doesn't seem to matter to people who support him and the broader administration. As far as scientific literacy goes, I mean, I think we know that STEM education has been declining for a long time. And I guess that just goes to show that we need more of it. We need to support more science, technology, engineering, and math. And we had some policy efforts to support that. I really don't know under this administration what's going on. I mean, they want to do away with the Department of Education altogether. So, but this whole I think people don't really understand what a scientific research paper is, what peer review is, what the rankings that relate to the credibility of journals, scientific journals is. So that relates to all kinds of things: human health, climate change, and anybody can cherry pick what they want to support their ideology, and that's what he's doing.
Yeah. I'll just say one more thing. This discredited doctor, scientist, can no longer publish in any legitimate journal, so he started his own journal.
There you go. Yeah. Yeah. I mean, and a lot of research too is funded. And if you look at the fine print, you'll see that it was funded by a motivated interest, and people often don't know how to sort that out, even though that's pretty straightforward. So yeah, it's I mean, that's why reputation really matters. A journal like Nature or Science or the Lancet or the New England Journal of Medicine, all of these that have very high peer review standards and ratings, they're the gold standard for a reason. It's because they have very, very high thresholds for publication. Do you know what this person's journal is? Do you recall the name of it?
No, I don't. It's his name is Andrew Wakefield or Wakeman, and he has a following in the same way that any discredited researcher might have, and that's the reason why they discredit me is because I'm right. They don't, I disagree with them, therefore they're going to try to keep me from publishing.
Right. That's kind of a classic rationale.
The actual title of the journal, I think, is in today's or yesterday's Times.
Georgina, let's go back to the increasing heat and what it's going to do, if anything, to our ability to grow various crops. Is it going to increase the number of crops that can safely be grown in the U.S.? Is it going to start to push things north of the border into Canada, so our wheat is all going to come from Canada?
Yeah, so a great and educated question. So the Corn Belt is moving northward, and wheat, the wheat belt is also moving northward. There has been some research that supports this idea of a fertilization effect on corn that demonstrates that corn could actually thrive under heat conditions, but the window is very small. And that was actually the thinking like maybe 20 years ago. But now heat stress is causing all kinds of problems to all kinds of crops. So essentially what's happening is corn is moving north and wheat is moving north. Wheat is, thrives in colder conditions. And there's some evidence that certain things, like for example, blueberries are now grown in Peru. They weren't before, but they'll only be able to be grown in Peru for a tiny window. And growers there are making hay while the sun shines, to use an agricultural metaphor, because they can make money off of blueberries. And but the window is going to close, the water's going to dry up, the glaciers are going to go away, which are their primary water source. So all of these the benefits to certain crops that are short-lived, essentially. Um, and if you look at any big sweeping report from the UN or any kind of IPCC report or national climate assessment, these gold standard reports, they will all tell you the consensus is that in the long term, most crops are going to struggle. And water is going to be the primary issue.
Mhm.
Lack of it in some places and too much of it in others. So
So what happens to things like the Great Valley in California with all the fruit and vegetables? Are we going to see that start drying up?
well, as you know, and for those who don't, California has a major water issue, always has. The way the allotment system works, all of the water that's allotted goes to farmers that have had um, claims and ownership of those water rights for a really long time. And it's so complicated. We actually have a California agriculture reporter. She could spend all day just talking about the California water system. It's very, very complicated. But essentially, there's a lack of water there. And that, as many of you know, is the salad bowl of the country. It's where most of our what are called specialty crops, which are actually the things that we eat, like broccoli and lettuce, and they are all grown in California, or a lot of them are grown in California. So are things like avocados, which are high value, almonds, which are a high value crop, but consume a lot of water. So almonds are, from a water standpoint, just a really,
Hmm.
really bad crop.
Hmm.
And eventually California is, the Salinas Valley and the Central Valley of California, they're going to have to shift what they grow too. For those of you who like wine, that's bad news, because they don't grow as much wine in the Central Valley. But north and on the coast, those changing conditions are going to mean that grapes can't be grown there because the nights are too hot. So everything is going to have to adapt and shift. And again, water is going to be the primary issue. I don't know how many of you are gardeners, but the USDA's hardiness zone map, which tells us when we can plant and what we can plant, that has shifted too. So growing regions are essentially getting warmer as you go north. And there's some evidence or projections that suggest that growing conditions in parts of Alaska are going to be like they are in the American Southeast now in 100 years. So we're going to have to pivot quickly if we want to feed ourselves.
Oh. Does this also mean that animal raising is going to move north?
Um, Well, that is a good question. I mean, there are so many things right now being done to keep animals cool where they are. So, like in California, again, the biggest dairy state, they have sprinkler systems and huge fans and to keep the cows cool, because when they get hot, they don't produce milk. And there's a lot more dairy production in the dry, arid Southwest and in states like Idaho now than there used to be. And again, that's those are hot environments, and they need to bring in a lot of water. But land is cheap in many of those areas. So these have become the big dairy states, whereas, the typical ones like like Wisconsin and even New York, are producing less than they did before. The question as to whether animal raising is going to move north, I guess it depends on the adaptation measures in place where they are currently. And, because animal agriculture requires so many resources and is so carbon intensive, a lot of research, a lot of reports, including from the UN, suggest that developed countries like the US and many others need to really scale back on livestock, including dairy, because it is such a huge climate contributor.
Mary Bloodworth, you've got a question. You want to go ahead and ask it?
Sure, why not? So climate change is accelerating faster than originally expected. And in response to this, the US and other countries have elected administrations that are outright hostile to any change that they might have to do, or they're outright climate deniers. And this is all pretty depressing, basically. What good stuff is happening out there in the course of your research? Have you seen any innovative responses to, you said China had been working to lower their, what innovations have you seen that give us all a little hope?
Yeah, no, I that's a really good question, and I'm sorry if I seem like a bit of a downer. But the overall picture is, is quite discouraging. But there are some bright spots. And say what you will about China and our relationship with China, but they are really moving ahead with clean energy technologies. And renewables, solar, wind. We're seeing a lot of development of solar and wind, and we're seeing a lot of development of solar and wind here too. In fact, the biggest wind and solar state is also, one of our biggest petroleum producing states. It's Texas, and we have a lot of economic signals that have gotten louder over the last 5 to 10 years, suggesting that even in the US, which, as you suggested, has had administrations outright hostile to climate action, you have economic conditions that are undeniable and unchanged and won't change. There's money, again, it's money. There's money to be made in renewables and in solar and in wind and photovoltaics so the shift to the clean energy transition is very real and will continue. In my field, in my agricultural coverage, I see a lot of farmers implementing conservation measures that keep carbon in the soil. So like certain things like not tilling the land or planting what are known as cover crops, which help keep carbon in the soil. You have much more widespread adoption of that, and policy tweaks that have allowed those practices to become more popular. Conservation programs at the U.S. Department of Agriculture are very popular. Similarly, you have a lot of awareness on the part of consumers buying products, whether it's a food or a car, that have climate considerations built in. I think, again, shifting to the global perspective, you have a lot of countries that are realizing that these shifts to cleaner technologies have economic benefits, and so they're moving that way regardless of what we are doing in this country right now. That shift is happening. I also think that I'm very hopeful about the younger generation of children who have grown up with climate change. It's baked into their understanding of how they see the world. And I think you will have incoming um, uh, administrations, Republican or Democrat, you will have those younger people in positions of influence who have grown up with this reality and realize that something needs to be done about it, regardless of political orientation. I think what we're seeing right now, and have seen since January 20th, is so extreme, so reactionary, so punitive, um, and in many cases economically nonsensical, that it just seems like it's so ideologically driven. And it's such an overcorrection, um, uh, that I think there will be a recorrection, finding some kind of middle ground, regardless of political affiliation. I hope that that is true. So I feel hopeful about younger people who are going to be moved to act. But the window is closing. That's just the reality of the numbers of the greenhouse gas emissions. And if we want to slow the worst effects of climate change, we have to do it quickly. And the next 4 years are not going to help. That's just the truth.
In the last 5 minutes or so we've got, will you give us a preview of what your next articles are? What are you writing about and what should we
So
watch?
yeah, thank you. So I hope to, within not too long of a window, do a story about Senegal, where I just was, and about the prospects for the continent of Africa, which is currently a net importer. They import most of their food, to become a little bit more self-sufficient, despite the challenges posed by climate change. So that's one story. The other story that I'm working on is it's a big project that'll take some months. It's about the environmental and climate impacts of China's Belt and Road Initiative, which is this
Um,
massive infrastructure project that I'm sure you've heard of. In the very short term, like this week, like tomorrow, and maybe the day after that, I'm working on a story about how the current administration is pulling billions of dollars in funding from um, rural and agricultural projects that were intended to have energy and climate benefits. So they're just stripping away millions of dollars from these projects. In many cases, some of them have been committed, and the people have already spent the money on new solar panels. They applied to the government for the funding. They got the government committed to paying for whatever X it was, whether it was a solar panel array or more efficient irrigation system or whatever it was. These are small businesses that have laid out tens of thousands of dollars, and this administration is saying, sorry, you're out of luck. We told you we were going to pay, Biden said he was going to pay you for these projects. We're not. So that's a story that I'm working on this week. And yeah, so those are just a few of the things in the pipeline.
Mhm. Mhm. Okay, I don't see other hands or things in the chat. So before we go, let me tell you a little bit about the next programs. Our April Village Voices is on April 8. And if this seemed a bit gloomy today, just wait, because we're going to talk about the doomsday clock. And it's Susan Koch, who lives here on the Hill, and she's a specialist in the policy issues regarding arms reduction and proliferation of weapons of mass destruction. She's very alarmed about where we are on the doomsday clock, and so she's going to be talking with us about where we are in the current state of control of nuclear arms. So that's April 8. May 5 is going to be a wholly different kind of thing. It is David Pellizzari, and what he does is he helps people who want to buy rare books. And he's going to talk about what makes a book rare, what makes it valuable, how do you know if you've got one, how do you know if you should buy one, and what should you do if you think you've just inherited a cache of wonderful books that are going to make you a fortune. And then finally, on June 9, before we take our summer break, we're going to have April Linton. She's president of the board of City Wildlife, Inc., but especially she coordinates their Duck Watch program. And May is a big Duck Watch month here in the city. And so in June, she's going to be with us talking about ducks and other wildlife in the city and what we can do to preserve them. And so with that, if there are no more questions, thank you, Georgina. This was wonderfully interesting and great fun to have you with us. Thanks a lot. Bye, everybody.
Welcome. Thank you very much for having me.
Thanks so much.